You ever had something you knew you should do? Like it was obviously the right thing. You knew it would be healthy for you. You knew it would be good. Other people were doing it. They seemed happy. And you wanted to do it, right? But for whatever reason, you couldn't make yourself. Well, for years, that was the story of me and my weight. Like so many people, as the realities of adulthood set in, marriage, career, responsibility, I found it increasingly difficult to find time to work out and stay in shape. And at the same time, I figured out that a cold beverage and a bag of chips did wonders for my stress. So before long, the trim 185-pound athlete that my wife had married had ballooned into this: a 300-pound couch potato who got winded walking to the fridge. Now here's the thing. I wanted to be in shape. I wanted to be healthy and have energy and be able to do the things I loved. I wanted to look good in pictures and feel good in my clothes and be able to see my feet every now and then, right? And I knew how, right? Eat less, exercise more. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't make myself do it. Sure, there were times when my wife had to turn the camera sideways to fit me in the picture, or I had to buy a new belt where I'd get motivated and start exercising, right? I'd get the gym membership, I'd buy all the gear, I'd clear out the cupboards, throw out all the junk food, stock up on veggies, the whole deal. And this would last about 2 days until I found that Kit Kat that I had hidden on the top shelf, right? You know what I'm talking about. No matter how bad I wanted to be in shape, I couldn't make it happen on my own. But then, in the span of about 3 or 4 weeks in early 2017, I had what I thought were a series of unrelated, unplanned conversations about my weight with 3 of my friends: Greg, Jimmy, and Garrett. Now, as it turns out, these were not random conversations at all. They were a well-coordinated attack. These guys loved me, and they wanted what was best for me, so they encouraged me to take the Raw Fitness Challenge. Right, a 6-week exercise and nutrition program that's designed to jumpstart your fitness by helping you lose 20 pounds in 6 weeks. Now, Jimmy and Greg had already done it. They both had great success. They both lost over 30 pounds in 13 weeks, and so I was inspired. I wanted what they had. And Garrett, my pizza buddy, wanted it too. Now, you know what a pizza buddy is, right? A pizza buddy is somebody that you eat pizza and wings with while watching sports you can no longer play, because you eat too much pizza and wings, all right? So anyways, one day Garrett, oddly enough, over pizza and wings, has decided he's had enough, right? He's tired of being overweight. He's tired of feeling sluggish. So he looks at me and says, "I'll do it if you do it." So all of a sudden, I have somebody walking beside me. I've got somebody who's in it with me. And for those first 6 weeks, not once did I have to work out alone. One of them, Jimmy, Greg, or Garrett, would always show up to work out with me. Jimmy would say, "Hey, work the program, follow the diet, don't miss a day." Greg would yell out, "You can do it," as he passed me on all the runs. And Garrett, on those days, whenever my legs hurt too bad to walk upstairs, Garrett would push the button and ride the elevator with me. Yeah, for the first time in years, I had people encouraging me to stick with it. And then on the final day, I was still a pound away from my goal, and Greg got up early on a Saturday morning, came and he worked out beside me. He wouldn't let me give up, wouldn't let me give in, and then he stood right next to me when I did my final weigh-in, and he celebrated even more than I did when we saw the number on the scale. It was awesome. After years of not being able to make a dent in my weight, I was finally on the path to health. And in the last 2.5 years, I've lost another 35 pounds. I've become consistent with diet and exercise. And at age 47, I feel better, stronger, healthier than I did at any point in my 30s. But you know what's crazy about that? Even after all of that, it's still not easy. It still takes work to get up at 5:30 every morning to go to the gym. It still takes work to eat egg whites instead of donuts for breakfast. But here's what I've learned in the last 3 years. All of that becomes so much more doable when I have people doing it with me. And the same is true in the Christian life. All those good, healthy, life-giving things that we want to do, but we struggle so hard to make ourselves do, every last one of them gets easier whenever we have people walking beside us, inspiring us, encouraging us, and celebrating with us along the way. Now, if you're like me, so often when Drew or Mitch or Jody or anybody gets up here and they start talking about the whys and the hows of the Christian life, they make it sound so easy, don't they? Like Drew. Drew will be like, yeah, I went and got a cup of coffee, or I went for a hike, or I had open heart surgery. And somehow he points people to Jesus in every single one of those situations. And it's true, he does. Drew lives the stuff that he talks about every week. But we can't hear the ease with which he tells stories about bringing life as an indication that it's always been easy for him to bring life. You see, it takes work, it takes effort and intentionality, even for pastors. But here's the good news, and this is true for anybody. Bringing life gets immeasurably easier when we do it with other people. That's why we hear Drew talk so regularly about his life group. They're the people who help him do all those good, healthy things that he wants to do but would struggle to do on his own. They're the ones standing with him and making it happen. And the same is true for all of us. You see, if we try to live the Christian life as individuals rather than in community with good friends, it becomes so easy, so tempting for it to become a comparison game. Right? We look at the guy or the girl who's up on stage telling us what's what about living deeply with Jesus, and we just think, well, I could never do what she does. I mean, of course she can do it. She's a pastor. She gets paid to be good. She doesn't have to live in my world or face what I face. But we don't really know anything about the people on stage, do we? Right? We don't know if the things they're talking about come easy or hard for them. We don't know what they had to go through in order to get up and talk about that. We don't know how often they succeed or fail. We just assume that because they're on stage that somehow they're better at this than we are. And we do the same thing when we read the Bible. We look at it and we think, well, maybe it was easier back then to live for Jesus, or maybe just those people were somehow better than us. And when we do that, we create this false dichotomy in our minds that there are two different groups of Jesus followers. There are the super Christians who seem to be able to do everything that Jesus says, and then there's the rest of us. So full disclosure, as the dude whose job it is to be this week to tell you what's what about the Christian life, I need you to know, it's really important that you know, that if there is such a thing as super Christians, I'm not one of them, okay? This thing we've been talking about, faces and places, pointing people to Jesus, man, I'm getting better at it, but it takes effort. I fail at it regularly. But here's what gives me encouragement. Here's what gives me hope. Paul, the guy who wrote like 13 letters in the New Testament, in fact, one of the letters we're going to look at here in just a second, Paul, the guy who's supposedly the greatest of all time at this whole faces and places thing, there was a time when it was hard for him too. Right? This wasn't always easy. Now, we're going to look at that in just a second, but first, I want to hear what Paul says after he's been following Jesus for 20 years. He says this in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 20. He says, so we are Christ's ambassadors. God is making his appeal through us. We speak for Christ when we plead, come back to God. Paul says God has given us the task of making peace between him and those who don't know him. He says it is our job to point people into life with Jesus. And he does this by saying, we are Christ's ambassadors. In fact, turn to somebody next to you and say, you are an ambassador. All right, now this word ambassador, it's a big word. You see, an ambassador is someone who is both fiercely loyal to her king and deeply concerned about the well-being of those who don't know him. Right? She's totally bought into her king's values, principles, and ideals, and she's expected to live them out in a foreign, sometimes hostile land. So to be successful at what she does, she has to love the people of that land and be a curious student of their culture. In short, her job is to go where they are and humbly but intentionally introduce them to a better way of life. Oh, and by the way, they probably don't think they need a better way of life. And that's what Paul says all of us are supposed to do, right? We are supposed to humbly but intentionally go where people are and introduce them to a better way of life that they don't think they need. Does that sound easy to you? No. But Paul says it so confidently. He says, we are Christ's ambassadors. So because it sounds so hard to us, but it seems so easy or normal or natural for Paul, we automatically make the mental leap that somehow this wasn't hard for him, that he was somehow, genetically or spiritually predisposed to an elite level of righteousness, right? We just think, well, he's Paul. He's in the Bible. They wouldn't have written stories about him if he was like me. But the opposite is actually true. They wrote stories about Paul because he was just like you. If you have a Bible, flip over to Acts chapter 13. And as you do, I want to ask you to just believe me for a second. When I tell you that this whole faces and places, pointing people to Jesus, being an ambassador thing, it's not easy for anybody right out of the gate. So I want you over the next few minutes to imagine Paul. Not the Paul that you have grown up hearing about, not the Paul who wrote 13 letters of the New Testament, not the one who wrote 2 Corinthians chapter 5 after 20 years of walking with Jesus. I want you to imagine Paul as a brand new Jesus follower, filled with insecurities, questions, and doubts. All right, you with me? All right, in Acts chapter 13, Paul is a baby Christian. He's new to this whole Jesus thing. He has good days and he has bad days. He has days when he feels close to God and days when he feels miles away. Can anyone relate? Okay? We meet Paul for the very first time 5 chapters earlier in Acts chapter 8, and what he's doing there is he is supervising the execution of a Jesus follower named Stephen. So I think it's safe to assume that he was not yet an ambassador of Jesus. Would you agree? Okay, in chapter 9, he gets permission, from the governing authorities to go hunt Christians down, persecute them, and throw them in jail. But as he's doing this, he meets Jesus and begins to follow him. So at this point, Paul knows a great deal more about what it means to question or to distrust Christians than he does about how to point people to life in Jesus. Anybody tracking with this, Paul? Right? You're following Jesus now, but you know a lot more about what it is to be friends with people outside the church than people inside the church. All right, the next 3 chapters, Acts 10 through 12, there's virtually no mention of Paul whatsoever. All right, the only thing that we hear in those 3 chapters about Paul is that he met this guy named Barnabas, and that guy invested in him for about a year. So when we get to Acts chapter 13, Paul has maybe known Jesus for 12 to 18 months. He's new to this whole thing. He doesn't have all the answers. Anybody here in your first 18 months of following Jesus? Anybody at all? Awesome. That is so cool. All right. So with that little bit of context, let's look at what happens in Acts chapter 13, beginning with verse 1. It says, among the prophets and teachers of the church at Antioch of Syria were Barnabas, Simeon, called the Black Man, Lucius from Cyrene, Manaen, the childhood companion of King Herod Antipas, and Saul, who would later be called Paul. One day, as these men were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, appoint Barnabas and Saul for the special work to which I have called them. Have you ever been sitting in life group and it becomes painfully obvious that the person leading, the person in charge, is going to call on somebody to pray? So you start doing everything you can to not make eye contact, right? Because you are scared to death of praying in public. Anybody know what I'm talking about? It's terrifying, isn't it? Now imagine that you're in the same circle Paul is. And instead of calling on you to pray, they say, we want you to go to other cities, other places, and share Jesus with other faces. How are you going to feel then? Right? Paul's like, what the what? I mean, hold on a minute. I came here to maybe sing some songs and drink some coffee and maybe go to next steps. Right? But what are you talking about, this whole faces and places? What do you mean be an ambassador? Because Paul's a real dude with real anxieties and real fears and real insecurities, right? Right. But if we kept reading, what we'd find is that new as he was to the faith, Paul obeyed. He packed his things and he went off to share Jesus with new faces in new places. Now, just like it would be for us, those first few steps, they were terrifying. They were filled with self-doubt and insecurity. But Paul took them. So clearly, there's a lesson here for us. Take that first step. Go to that place. Love that face. But what if we want to do more? Right? What if we want to do more than take a single step? Well, what if over the next several weeks, months, or years, we decide to go on a journey similar to Paul's, right? Not as traveling missionaries, but as people who go from occasionally wanting to point our friends to Jesus to people who are living as ambassadors for him. What would have to change? What would we have to do? Well, what did Paul do? From the beginning of his journey with Jesus, Paul surrounded himself with people who were stumbling in the same direction. People who would inspire him, encourage him, challenge him, and celebrate with him along the way. In Acts 13, it's Barnabas and Simeon and Lucius and Manaen. In the chapters that follow, we meet people like Timothy and Silas and John Mark and Luke. As we continue to read the letters of Paul, we find him hanging out with Priscilla and Aquila and Epaphroditus and Onesiphorus and Rufus and Lydia and Julia and Claudia and Jason and Phoebe. And just wherever we see Paul's name written in Scripture, we see somebody else standing beside him. When we survey the life of Paul from Acts chapter 13, where he is a brand new believer avoiding eye contact in the prayer circle, to 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where he is confidently an ambassador for Jesus, is that Paul always surrounded himself with other people who had the same ideas, principles, and values that he did. They loved Jesus, they loved their friends, and they wanted the two to meet each other. Those were the people Paul did life with. Now, most of the time in Scripture, Paul's the ringleader, right? He's the one who's calling other people to join him and going to new faces and new places, but that wasn't always the case. You see, there was a time when Paul was the newbie, right? He's the new kid on the block he's being invited in. And we get to read a little bit about that in Acts chapter 15. You see, Paul is invited to what's called the Jerusalem Council. It's basically this conference where people are going to give reports about what they're seeing happen around the world in the name of Jesus. And there he's going to get to meet some of his heroes in the faith. So Paul is presenting, and he's telling a story about how it is that God's been using him to help the message of Jesus get spread to all these unexpected people groups. And as he's talking, James, one of the absolute heroes of the faith, hears it, and he starts thinking, oh, hey, this sounds like a story of a time I remember with Peter, when Peter did something similar. Now Paul thought he had heard all of the Peter stories. Right? He'd heard stories about Peter preaching and thousands being saved, Peter healing the sick, Peter walking on water. I mean, Peter was Paul's hero, right? Like Paul had a Peter lunchbox, right? A big cardboard cutout in the corner of his room. I mean, so he just thought he'd heard all the Peter stories there were. But now James is telling a new one about Peter taking the story of Jesus to a new face in a new place. And in the story, Peter is freaked out. Now, Drew told this story last week, so I'm not going to retell it. If you want, you can go back and read it in Acts 10. There's a full accounting of it in Acts 15. There's an abbreviated account. But here's the thing. If you were here, you'll remember that God asked Peter to do something way outside his comfort zone. He said, I want you to be an ambassador. I want you to take the story of Jesus to one of your oppressors, to a Roman centurion named Cornelius. And Peter scared. Right? Peter knew he couldn't do it on his own. He knew he wouldn't do it on his own. So in Acts chapter 10, verse 23, it says he got some of his brothers together and they went. Right? He's like, I need a posse to do this. I need my gang, and we got to go do this together because I am scared. Now, can you imagine what it did for Paul? Can you imagine what it did for him to hear that Peter had once been scared too, that it once had been difficult for him to be an ambassador? It had to inspire him. It had to encourage him. He wasn't the only one. And so Paul's friend Luke, who's taking in this whole scene, Luke, by the way, ends up writing the book of Acts. Luke is taking in this scene, and he's trying to describe what it is that he sees Paul feeling in this moment. And he comes up with this really unique word to describe what happens as Paul hears James tell the story of Peter. He uses the word homothumadon. Let me hear you say homothumadon. Wow, more energy. Homothumadon. I told you, this is a really unique word. Say it with me. Homothumadon. All right, okay, so this word homothumadon, it is usually translated as one accord, one mind, one passion. And those are all good translations, but they fall a little short. Literally translated, homothumadon is to rush along in unison. But even that doesn't carry the full essence. You see, in the first century, this word was a musical term, explaining how different people could play different notes on different instruments, and they would all harmonize together in pitch and tone. And so as Luke is taking in the scene, he says that's how Paul felt. He felt like he and Peter were different instruments playing from the same sheet of music. Now, hold on to that image. I could tell you're super excited about it, so you're going to want to remember that image. But hold on, we're going to come back to it in just a second. But first, I want to just quickly summarize where we've come so far. All right? So we start off in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 20, and Paul says, we are Christ's ambassadors, and we're all like, no, that sounds really hard. And then we start listening, and we realize that, no, Paul grew in comfort and in his capacity to be an ambassador by surrounding himself with other people. And then we find out that, he's in Acts chapter 15. He gets to meet his hero in the faith, and he realizes that Peter did the same thing, that he surrounded himself with people, and that's how he got better at being an ambassador for Jesus. But now we have to ask ourselves the question, where did Peter learn how to do this? Well, he learned it from Jesus. When we read through the stories of Jesus' life, what we find is that one of the first things that he did when he arrived here on earth as heaven's ambassador was gather people to journey with him. We hear him walking up to fishermen and saying, hey, come with me and I'll teach you how to fish for men. Now, unlike us, Jesus wasn't scared, right? He didn't need encouragement or inspiration, but he knew that we would. So from the very beginning, he modeled this for us. He gathered around himself 12 good friends, one of whom happened to be Peter. And from that point forward, he is seemingly never alone. And then in Mark chapter 6, he gathers these 12 friends, including Peter, and he says, hey, it's time for you to go to new faces in new places. I need you to take the story of my life and go and tell people there's a better way to live. And as he sends them out, he sends them 2 by 2. And then in Luke chapter 10, he gathers 72 more of his friends. And he says, it's time for you to go to new faces in new places. You need to tell people that there's a better way of life. And then he sends them out 2 by 2. You see this 2 by 2 going together pattern? That's how Jesus started his ambassador program. He knew that we would need people to walk beside us, inspiring us, encouraging us, and celebrating with us along the way. And the 12 and the 72, they were men and women just like us, right? They had met Jesus and they'd encountered him and he had grabbed hold of their imagination and their mind and they wanted to give their lives to him. And so when he invites them to join him in bringing life to everyone, everywhere, every day, they are pumped like this is the best news ever. So they all pull out their blue Bring Life t-shirts and they put them on. They're like, we're going to go change the city. They were excited. This was something they wanted to do. But like us, they had a million reasons why they couldn't do it. I'm an introvert. I don't know how to start the conversation. I'm socially awkward. I don't want to alienate my friends and family. I don't want people to think I'm weird. Faith is such a personal thing. Who am I to impose? Maybe when I know more, or maybe when I get transferred to my new job assignment. Any of these sound familiar? Any of these the ones that we use? See, Jesus knew the fears, anxieties, and excuses that people use. So you absolutely have to love that he didn't shame any of us for it. Right? He didn't say, suck it up, go change the world. No. He looked at our fears and insecurities. He said, how about we use the buddy system? Jesus sent people out 2 by 2 so that when they were far from home, they'd know they weren't alone. And this was super important in Mark 6 and Luke 10, because at that time in history, the story of Jesus was confined to a pretty small portion of the globe. It needed to spread, it needed to expand. So Jesus was sending them out to new cities and new regions, entirely new faces and places. But that's not really what he's doing with most of us, is it? Right? There are still some of us he's sending to new people groups and other countries and things like that, but for most of us, he's just calling us to do it right where we are. So what's the modern equivalent of going 2 by 2? It's pretty much this. As you are humbly but intentionally introducing your friends to Jesus, aka being an ambassador, when it makes sense, invite 1 or 2 of your friends who know Jesus to do something with your friends who don't. That's it. Right? Don't make it weird. Don't gang up on them. Don't even invite them to church. Have them over for dinner, host a cornhole tournament, take them to a concert or to a game, start a book club, whatever. Just do life with people. And when it makes sense, cross-pollinate. Bring the 2 groups together. You see, this going 2 by 2 and pointing people to Jesus, it's not tag team wrestling. It's not one size fits all. It's not A plus B equals C. It's pretty much this. Look for people you know who have things in common, introduce them to each other, and trust that your friends who know Jesus are going to live well in front of your friends who don't. Going 2 by 2 in our day and age is pretty much introducing cool people to cool people and seeing what Jesus does with it, right? So if you're picking up what I'm laying down, right, if you're catching what I'm dropping this morning, you have probably figured out that this room, inviting people to church, is not step 1. It's not step 2, it's not step 3, it's probably not even step 200. Ambassadors go where people are. Ambassadors live where people are. So it is far more likely, if you are an ambassador of Christ, that you're inviting people to your home for Taco Tuesday than you are to invite them to a church social, right? If you are an ambassador of Jesus, you are far more likely to hand your friends tickets to a game and say, hey, let's go to this together, than you are to walk up to a complete stranger and hand them a gospel tract and say, you're going to hell. We laugh about it because we've seen it happen. So here's the thing. I've given you like half a dozen different ideas of ways you could do this. You probably had 10 more ideas pop in your head while I was talking. Craig gave you one, this date night we've got coming up. If that's where your friends are at and you're in that part of your relationship with them, invite them to date night. In your program, there's something about Treat Your Street we're encouraging you to do on Halloween. I mean, whatever. Just do something. Do something. And here's why you need to go 2 by 2 and do something. Because you don't know. You don't know when, where, or how. God is going to use something you do, or something you say, or someone you introduce your friend to bring people to Him. You don't know. In May of 2017, my friends Jeremiah and Amber got divorced. They divided assets, sold their home, figured out custody with their kids, and set out to do life apart. And as happens with so many divorces, friends had to pick sides, or at least felt like they had to pick sides. And this even extended into the church that they were attending at the time. It seemed like people were picking sides, and so all of a sudden church wasn't safe for them anymore. So Jeremiah and Amber just felt alone, angry, confused, hurt, all of it. And then on October 1st, 2017, Jeremiah, who is a Metro officer, happened to be working the Route 91 festival. Amber, his ex-wife, went to bed early that night, so she had no idea what was happening in our city. The next morning, she wakes up to dozens upon dozens of text messages. And so she begins frantically trying to call Jeremiah. She's got to find out if he's okay. She needs to find out what's going on. They have kids together. And finally, when she gets through, after several hours, they decide to meet up for dinner. And that dinner, and really probably more so the tragedy that befell our city, caused all of these mixed emotions to well up inside them. They still had anger towards each other, but they also knew they loved each other. And so all these things were going on, and that caused them to be willing to talk to each other every now and then. And maybe, just maybe, go somewhere together. Meanwhile, a retired Metro officer named Greg on October 2nd is trying to figure out how he can help. Like his mind, he's just beside himself, and he's trying to figure out how can I make a difference. And so he begins to think, well, what do these guys need? They need a diversion, right? They and their families need a fun night filled with good food and lots of laughter and probably some people who don't run in their normal circles. People aren't going to remind them of what they do every day of their life. So Greg and his friend Jimmy get together and they host an event at Topgolf and invite all of these police officers along with some other people that they know to come over and just have a fun evening. Well, Jeremiah and Amber end up being on the guest list. They show up together and they meet this incredible couple, Steve and Jamie, who have the ability to talk to anyone, anywhere, anytime and make them feel comfortable and safe. Meanwhile, back in the shadows, wondering why she's even been invited to an event like this, is my introvert of a wife named Carigwin, right? She has zero ability to start a conversation with strangers. But once she meets somebody, she remembers every intimate detail that they share with her, and she has the ability to empathize deeply. So Jamie waves Carigwin over, and she and Amber and Jamie and Carigwin, they all have this conversation, and they just go their separate ways. A couple months later, Amber finds herself on the sidelines of a Little League game where she runs into this girl named Lane, and they strike up a friendship over the next several months, and they just start talking about life and family and kids and baseball, just normal, everyday stuff. But because Lane loves Jesus and is convinced that people's lives are better when they have him in it, every now and then, when it made sense, she would just drop a little story about Jesus into the conversation. And this, along with a guy named Brendan, who's also a Jesus follower, who happened to work with Jeremiah and stood by him through all his struggles, these things together caused Jeremiah and Amber to begin journeying back to Jesus. Fast forward to Halloween 2018, when Lane invites Carigwin and me, along with Jeremiah and Amber, over to her house to hang out and hand out candy to some of the neighborhood kids. Now, here's where it gets weird, right? Or this is where God does what God does. Lane had no idea that Amber and Carigwin had ever met before. She just thinks these two girls would have a great time together. So she invites them over, and then as Carigwin and I walk in the kitchen and she and Amber make eye contact, my introverted wife, who remembers every last detail somebody shares, just looks across the room and says, "Top golf." And that immediately starts this amazing evening where three couples get to know each other a little bit better, and we eat some great food, and we talk, and we laugh, and we tell stories. And in the midst of all of it, in a completely unplanned way, we begin telling stories of healing and redemption. And it's then that we get to hear the story of Jeremiah and Amber journeying back to Jesus and each other and the church. So as Carigwin and I got in the car that night to go home, we had what the writer of Acts would call a homo thumadon moment. A moment where we realized that God had been writing and orchestrating this amazing song in Jeremiah and Amber's life that he let us and Greg and Jimmy and Steve and Jamie and Lane and Brendan and dozens of other people's names who I will never know play a very small part in it. Like I said earlier, homo thumadon is a musical term that paints a picture of different people playing different notes on different instruments that under the direction of a master conductor all harmonize together to create a beautiful song. Another way of saying it would be that as friends of Jesus, we're all playing from the same sheet of music. Alone, our note, our part of the song may not sound like much, right? It may even be a little bit off key. But when combined with all the other notes that God is sounding in their life through all the other Jesus followers that they interact with on a daily basis, eventually that song kind of comes together and it becomes this beautiful thing that moves people to Him. You see, the problem, the real reason why most of us find this whole idea of faces and places so daunting is that we think we have to play the whole song by ourselves. Right? When it comes to our friends and family, our faces and places, we feel like the burden is on us. We have to compose the music from start to finish. We have to figure out a way to move our friends from A to Z. And then, once we figured that out, we have to conduct the symphony, right? We have to manipulate and control every moment, every interaction, every thought, every word that they hear. And that's not just hard. That's impossible. So 12 times in Scripture, we, the church, are referred to as homo thumadon, a host of diverse people playing different notes from the same sheet of music. God is writing the song. He is the conductor. We don't have to know all the parts. We don't even have to know when the other parts are, when, where, or how they're going to join the song. All we have to do is sound our notes. All we have to do is when the Holy Spirit nudges, prompts, or points, sound our note. You see, God has an amazing plan for all our faces and all our places, and He is writing and orchestrating a beautiful, epic song in their lives that will move them and woo them to Jesus. All He asks is that you sound your note, that you sound your note, that I sound my note, that we all, as we go through life, sound our notes. And as we do, the music will get louder and louder in their ears. And with each new Jesus follower that they meet at Starbucks or at school or at their place of business, they will begin to hum along with this catchy tune. And then in a moment, in an instant that we could have never choreographed or caused, we will all come together in celebration as they join the song.
So we will
may that song be true of us. May we go wherever Jesus sends us and sound our note as the Spirit prompts us. May we have the incredible privilege of hearing the song of Jesus crescendo in the lives of our friends and watch them join him. Have a great week.